Welcome back to the deep dive.
It's good to be diving back in.
So for the last couple of sessions, we've really been wading deep into Schumpeter's, well, monumental work, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy.
Definitely monumental.
And we've been following his argument, which, it's brilliant, but it's also quite unsettling, isn't it? This idea about the inevitable decline of capitalism.
Exactly. That central thesis that capitalism's very success contains the seeds of its own eventual, transformation or destruction, depending on how you look at it.
Right, its own internal contradictions sort of eating away at it. So today, we're moving on. We're turning the page to part 3.
The big pivot.
The big pivot, yeah. And this is where we really need to maybe sharpen our focus, because we're tackling probably the single most provocative question that comes out of everything we've discussed so far.
Which is?
Can the alternative system, can socialism actually function? Can it work?
Yeah, that really is the core question, isn't it? And it's where Schumpeter, I think, really shows his characteristic intellectual rigor, maybe even a certain kind of honesty. Because like you said, we finished part 2 basically concluding that, in his view, capitalism's spectacular success leads inexorably to its own decay.
So just to quickly recap that foundation for everyone listening, we talked about how Schumpeter saw the innovative entrepreneur, that engine of creative destruction, becoming sort of obsolete, right, as companies get bigger.
Precisely. Big corporations, bureaucracy, R&D departments, they replace that dynamic, maybe sometimes chaotic individual innovator.
The function itself doesn't disappear, but the person, the social type, fades.
Right. Innovation becomes institutionalized, routinized. You get professional managers, people who think more like, civil servants than risk-taking entrepreneurs.
And at the same time, the social fabric that supported capitalism, things like private property as a sacred concept, the traditional family structure starts to erode.
Yeah, under attack from intellectuals and cultural shifts that, ironically, capitalism itself helped create by fostering critical thought and, affluence.
So the system sort of hollows out from the inside. It loses its cultural legitimacy, its moral authority, maybe long before the economic engine actually sputters out.
That's the core of the decline argument. So if capitalism is, in Schumpeter's view, destined to fade away, then he has to ask the next logical question. He moves past just predicting change to looking at the practical, institutional reality of whatever might come next.
Right. What does the successor system actually look like? How does it operate?
Exactly. And this is where he just cuts through all the usual debates, the moralizing, the ideology. Schumpeter isn't really interested here in whether socialism is, ethically better or worse.
He's not waving a banner for it.
Not at all. He approaches it purely as a technical problem, an institutional design challenge.
No.
His mission in this whole section is basically to answer one thing. Can a centrally planned economy actually function? Logically, practically?
And his initial answer, coming from someone who was, fundamentally a bourgeois economist, a defender of many aspects of capitalism, it's still kind of stunning.
It is. It's remarkably direct. His starting point is basically, can socialism work? Of course it can.
Just like that.
Just like that. He says, no doubt is possible about that. But, and this is crucial, he immediately adds some really important caveats.
Okay, what are the conditions?
2 main ones. First, the society has to have reached the necessary stage of industrial development. You can't just impose this on, say, an agrarian society.
So it needs the industrial-based capitalism built.
Absolutely. It inherits that. And second, the really complex problems of actually transitioning from capitalism to socialism have to be successfully managed. If you can meet those 2 conditions, he argues, then the basic economic logic of a socialist system is sound. It can work.
Okay, so that's a huge claim. Let's unpack it. And I guess the first step is getting really clear on what Schumpeter means by socialism, because he's incredibly precise with his definitions here.
Yes, definitions are key for him. He always starts by laying out the institutional structures he's comparing. So he contrasts 3 basic types of society.
Right. What's the first one?
The broadest category is what he calls commercial society. This is defined by 2 main things: private property and the means of production, and the productive process being mainly regulated by private contracts, private management, private initiative.
So sort of the bedrock for any market system.
Pretty much. Think of it as the foundation.
But as we've discussed before, he makes a distinction. Commercial society isn't exactly the same as capitalism in his view.
Correct. For Schumpeter, capital society is a specific historical version of commercial society. What makes it uniquely capitalist is this extra element, the phenomenon of credit creation.
Ah, the banks creating money.
Exactly. Financing businesses not just with accumulated savings, but by banks essentially manufacturing purchasing power, creating deposits or notes specifically for entrepreneurs to use. That dynamic element of credit is central to his whole theory of business cycles and what makes capitalism so, well, volatile and dynamic compared to a more static commercial setup.
Okay, so commercial society is the base. Capitalism adds credit creation and dynamism. So what defines the third category, the one we're focusing on now, the socialist society?
Here, Schumpeter focuses specifically on what he terms centralist socialism. And again, it's defined purely by its institutional structure.
Sure.
Control over the means of production factories, land, machines, and control over production itself is vested in a central public authority. He calls it the central board, or maybe a ministry of production.
So the key shift is economic decision-making moving decisively from the private sphere to the public sphere.
That's the essence of it. The state runs the economic show.
And he's quite explicit, isn't he, about ruling out other forms of socialism that were being discussed then, things like guild socialism or syndicalism.
Absolutely. He sets those aside for this analysis. His focus on centralist socialism is deliberate because for the technical analysis of economic calculation to work cleanly, he needs a unified system.
Why is that?
Well, if you have multiple autonomous units, say, different industries or workers' councils controlling their own sectors independently, you risk recreating the same problems capitalism had. Competing interests, strategic maneuvering, lack of coordination, maybe even antagonism.
So it wouldn't be a truly planned economy.
Exactly. He wants to analyze a system designed for maximum rational coordination from the center.
Okay, but does centralist mean totally rigid, top-down control, like one person deciding everything?
No, and that's an important nuance he adds. He clarifies that centralist doesn't imply absolute centralism in every single decision. That would be wildly inefficient.
How's?
Well, the central authority, the Ministry of Production, let's call it, has to delegate. It needs to give significant operational freedom to the people actually running things on the ground. The managers of individual factories or industries, the men on the spot, as he calls them.
So the center sets the big picture.
Right. The center handles the overall economic plan, allocates major resources, sets the crucial accounting prices we'll talk about later. But the day-to-day running of the factory, how to actually make the widgets most efficiently, that has to be decentralized.
He has that funny analogy, doesn't he, about potatoes.
Yes. It's a great way to put it. He says management shouldn't be hampered by absurdly detailed central orders, referencing Mark Twain's joke about ridiculously specific government rules for harvesting potatoes.
Right.
The central authority decides how many potatoes society needs, perhaps, but it doesn't tell the local manager exactly how to dig them up, which spade to use or when to take a break. That operational freedom is vital for efficiency. Otherwise, the bureaucracy just gets bogged down in useless detail.
So ultimate control is public and central, but execution needs to be flexible and decentralized within that framework.
Precisely. Now, beyond this economic structure, Schumpeter makes a really profound point, one that kind of challenges simple economic determinism. If we define socialism just by this central ownership structure, what does that actually tell us about the kind of society that results? The culture, the politics.
And his answer is?
Surprisingly little, actually. This leads him to this idea he calls the cultural indeterminateness of socialism.
Cultural indeterminateness. Okay, what does that mean?
He fully accepts that socialists aren't just aiming for economic efficiency. They usually have higher goals, right? More than just, as he puts it, beefsteaks and radios.
They envision a new world, a different kind of civilization.
Exactly. Like he says, Christianity means more than just getting into heaven or avoiding hell. It implies a whole way of life, a cultural outlook. Socialism often carries similar aspirations.
Right.
But, Schumpeter argues, the economic structure itself, central ownership, doesn't guarantee any particular cultural or political outcome.
Wow. So that pushes back hard against the traditional Marxist idea that the economic base determines the superstructure.
Very much so. He's saying, look, if all you know is that the means of production are centrally owned, you still know almost nothing definite about the political system, the ethical values, the social hierarchy, or the overall feel of that society. Central ownership, he says, is a cultural Proteus.
Proteus, the shapeshifter from mythology, meaning it can take many forms.
Exactly. It can morph into almost anything culturally or politically.
Okay, let's pause on that because it's a really striking idea. If we assume Schumpeter's economic definition is met central control, what kind of political systems could logically emerge, according to him?
Well, the range he outlines is huge, and it really highlights his attempts at analytical neutrality. He says a socialist society could, logically, be run by an absolute dictator, or it could be highly democratic, it could be aristocratic, maybe reserving power and privileges for the most competent managers and planners.
Or it could be thoroughly proletarian and equal.
Right. It could be deeply religious, a theocracy, or completely atheist. It could be incredibly disciplined or quite lax. It could be militaristic and expansionist, or peaceful and focused inward. Highly egalitarian, or the complete opposite, with stark inequalities in status or power.
So basically, just changing the economic engine doesn't automatically determine the car's design, color, or destination.
That's a good way to put it. It fundamentally challenges the utopian socialist dream that just by eliminating private ownership and profit, you automatically get peace, freedom, equality, and universal brotherhood.
Schumpeter's saying, nope, you just get a different way of organizing production. What you do with that organization, culturally and politically, is a separate question entirely. It depends on who's in charge and what their goals are.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting for how we evaluate the whole thing. Because of this indeterminateness, Schumpeter notes someone could theoretically be a passionate socialist, really wanting that central control, even if they believed it would be less economically efficient than capitalism. Why? Because they desire the specific cultural outcome they hope it will bring, say, perfect equality or maybe a highly ordered society.
And conversely,
you could despise a socialist regime on cultural grounds. Maybe it turns out to be ruthlessly authoritarian or stiflingly conformist, even if it's incredibly successful at churning out those beefsteaks and radios.
So the economic performance and the cultural desirability are two separate axes of evaluation.
Absolutely. And Schumpeter, for the purpose of his analysis in these chapters, deliberately separates them. He basically says, okay, let's put the cultural question aside for now. Let's bracket out all the hopes and fears about what kind of civilization socialism might create.
And focus just on the mechanics.
Just on the economic blueprint itself. Can it work? Can it calculate rationally? That's the purely technical question he wants to answer first.
Okay, so now we dive into the real technical core. This was a huge debate in economics in the early 20th century, right? The so-called socialist calculation debate.
Absolutely. The central challenge was this. If you get rid of private ownership of the means of production, and you get rid of competitive markets for things like factories, machines, raw materials, how on earth do you make rational decisions about what to produce, how much to produce, and which methods are the most efficient?
How do you allocate resources effectively without market prices guiding you? That was the big question.
Exactly. Can socialist planners actually gather enough information and devise rules or procedures that allow them to essentially solve the incredibly complex equations needed to determine all the production decisions uniquely and efficiently?
And the major intellectual hurdle, the big challenge Schumpeter had to address, came from the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises.
Right. Mises' critique was incredibly influential, and many anti-socialists considered it basically the nail in the coffin for the idea of a workable socialist economy.
Can you lay out the Mises challenge for us? What was his basic argument?
Mises argued, quite forcefully, that rational economic activity depends entirely on being able to make rational cost calculations. To do that, you need to know the prices of all the things you use, the inputs, the factors of production, raw materials, machines, land, capital itself.
Okay, seems logical.
And Mises insisted genuine prices for these factors of production can only emerge from actual market exchange, buying and selling based on private property.
So, because in a centralist socialist state, the means of production are owned by the state and aren't actually bought and sold on a market.
They therefore have no real prices. And if there are no real prices for capital, goods, and resources, Mises concluded, there's no way for the central planners to rationally calculate costs. They'd be flying blind, making arbitrary decisions. Socialism, he argued, was literally impossible as a rational economic system.
It would just be chaos or guesswork.
That was the core of his argument.
Yeah.
And Schumpeter acknowledges that the initial responses from many orthodox socialists were, frankly, pretty weak.
What did they try to argue?
Some just relied on vague promises about future abundance, or they hoped they could somehow just inherit and use the price structures left over from the previous capitalist system. They didn't really offer a robust internal logic for how socialism itself could calculate.
They couldn't build the mechanism from first principles.
Exactly. And Schumpeter notes, with a certain degree of irony, that the definitive theoretical answer didn't come from the socialists themselves, but actually from mainstream bourgeois economists. People like the Italian economist Enrico Barone, writing even before Mises, and later Oscar Lange and others.
They showed mathematically the calculation was possible, even without private markets for capital goods.
Yes. They demonstrated that the problem was essentially one of solving a complex system of simultaneous equations. The logic held up.
And Schumpeter accepts their conclusion. What was that direct quote again?
He states it very plainly in Chapter 16. The answer is in the affirmative. There is nothing wrong with the pure logic of socialism.
Wow, that's a huge statement from him. So if the logic is sound, how does this socialist system actually do it? How does it create the necessary information, the functional equivalence of prices, to make rational calculations without those private capital markets?
Okay, this is where we get into the mechanics of the socialist blueprint. It starts with a fundamental institutional shift. Schumpeter highlights the separation of distribution and production.
What does that mean?
In capitalism, how much you earn, your share of distribution, is typically tied directly to what you contribute to production or what assets you own. The two are interconnected through markets.
Right, your wage, your profit, your rent.
In socialism, Schumpeter argues, distribution becomes primarily a political decision separated from the mechanics of production. The central authority decides how the social product will be shared. Will everyone get an equal share? Will income be based on merit or need or position?
That decision is made first politically.
Yes. It's arbitrary from a purely economic logic standpoint, but it has to be decided. For his analysis, Schumpeter often assumes the most complex case to test the logic. An egalitarian system where everyone gets an equal claim and consumers are free to choose what they want to buy.
Okay, so everyone gets, say, an equal number of credits or vouchers. How do they use them to signal demand?
Through what he calls consumer sovereignty, managed via this voucher system. The central board issues these vouchers. Schumpeter humorously suggests calling them dollars or maybe moons or suns, it doesn't matter what you call them. They represent a claim on a share of the total goods and services produced.
They're not money in the capitalist sense, but claims.
Exactly. Purchasing power within the system.
So people take these vouchers to the state-run stores. How are the prices of things like bread or shoes determined if there's no competition between sellers?
Through a process of trial and error, essentially managed by the central board, they'd start by assigning provisional prices to all consumer goods.
Just make a guess.
Initially, yes, perhaps based on past data or production costs. Then they watch what happens. If the social stores run out of bread instantly, the price is clearly too low relative to demand and production capacity. So the Bulgara raises the price in terms of vouchers.
And if nobody's buying the shoes?
Then the price is too high and they lower it. They keep adjusting these voucher prices until the flow of goods basically clears the shelves, supply matches demand as expressed by consumers spending their vouchers. This process effectively establishes the relative values, the social valuation of all final consumer goods.
Okay, that seems plausible for consumer goods. But the really tricky part, the Mises challenge, was about the factors of production. The steel, the labor hours, the complex machinery needed to make the bread and shoes. How does the system assign rational values or prices to those without markets?
This is the absolute crux of the Barone-Lange solution that Schumpeter adopts. It relies on the marginal cost principle.
Okay, marginal cost. Okay, break that down.
The core logic is deductive. Once consumers have expressed their demands for final goods by spending their vouchers, that demand implicitly places a value on all the resources needed to produce those goods. The demand for bread tells you something about the value of the flour, the ovens, the baker's labor, and so on, all the way back down the production chain.
So consumer demand is the starting point that ripples back through the system.
Exactly. Now, how do you make that calculation concrete? The blueprint requires the managers of the state-owned industries to behave in a very specific, rule-bound way.
They're not maximizing profit for themselves. What are they doing?
They are essentially acting as cost minimizers and output fulfillers, following strict instructions from the central board. They are given specific accounting prices for all the resources they might use: labor, raw materials, energy, use of machinery prices set by the board.
Okay.
And they must follow 3 key rules. 1, produce their assigned output as economically as possible, always trying to minimize the inputs used for a given output.
Standard efficiency.
2, turn over all the revenue, the vouchers they collect from selling their goods, either to consumers or other industries, back to the central board.
And the third crucial rule.
Rule 3 is the linchpin. They must equate price to marginal cost.
What does that mean in practical terms for a factory manager in this system?
It means they should demand and use resources, hire another worker, order more steel, run a machine for another hour, only up to the point where the cost of the resources needed to produce the very last unit of their output, the marginal unit, is equal to the price in vouchers they receive for that last unit.
So if making one more toaster costs the equivalent of 10 vouchers and resources, but the price they get for it's only 9 vouchers, they shouldn't make it.
Precisely. They start production at the point where marginal cost equals price. This rule forces them to implicitly account for the relative scarcity and value of resources as determined by the overall plan and consumer demand. It prevents wasteful overproduction.
So the manager's actions, following these rules, generate a derived demand for all the factors of production. How does the central board use that information to set those initial accounting prices for resources?
The central board acts like a central clearinghouse. It gathers up all the demands for resources coming from all the different industrial managers based on their production targets and their marginal cost calculations.
It aggregates all that demand data.
Yes. And then it performs the crucial step.
Right.
It sets a single, uniform accounting price for each specific factor of production, say grade A steel, or electrician's labor hours, or kilowatt hours of electricity, at the level that precisely clears the market.
Yeah.
Meaning the price is set so that the total amount demanded by all the managers exactly equals the total amount available supply of that resource within the economy. There should be no idle, unused resources left over and no managers demanding resources they can't get at that set price. Because if they demanded more, it would violate the marginal cost rule at that price.
So it's like creating a simulated market clearing price through calculation rather than through actual buying and selling between private owners.
That's exactly it. The whole problem of resource allocation becomes a vast but theoretically solvable mathematical calculation, a system of simultaneous equations reflecting consumer preferences, production possibilities, and resource constraints. The absence of private property doesn't destroy the logic of rational allocation. It just requires a different mechanism for computation.
Wow. Okay, so the logic holds.
According to Baron, Lange, and accepted by Schumpeter, yes, the formal logic is sound. And Schumpeter then adds a really important clarification here. He warns against thinking that this is socialism simply copying or borrowing tricks from capitalism.
What's his point there?
His point is deeper, he argues, quite profoundly. Our socialism borrows nothing from capitalism, but capitalism borrows much from the perfectly general logic of choice.
Okay, that's a big claim. Unpack that.
He's saying that the fundamental principles of rational economic behavior, weighing costs against benefits, allocating scarce resources to achieve desired ends, the logic of marginal utility and marginal cost, these are universal principles. They apply to any rational economic system.
Whether it's Robinson Crusoe alone on his island, figuring out whether to fish or gather coconuts.
Or a giant, centrally planned socialist state deciding whether to build more power plants or more hospitals. The underlying logic of rational choice is the same. Capitalism is just one specific historical system that applied this universal logic within a particular sociological context: private property, profit motive, markets, credit, landlords, wage labor, etc.
So the socialist blueprint, in this view, strips away the specific sociological features of capitalism, the profit-seeking entrepreneur, the income derived from ownership that it retains, and, Schumpeter might argue, potentially purifies the underlying rational economic logic.
Precisely. The terms use prices, costs, rent might sound capitalist, but in the socialist blueprint, they become purely accounting tools, indexes for rational calculation, detached from the social relations of capitalism.
One final point here. Schumpeter notes, this rationalized socialist system doesn't really resemble the textbook model of perfect competition with millions of tiny firms.
No, not at all. He finds that comparison analytically weak. In its structure, its physiognomy, he says, the socialist blueprint looks much more like the logical successor to big business capitalism.
How so?
It takes the trend of large-scale organization, centralized planning within big corporations, and the rise of bureaucratic management trends already happening under mature capitalism and extends them to the entire economy. It's like the ultimate rationalization of the large-scale industrial system that capitalism itself created.
Okay, so the theoretical blueprint is logically sound. It can calculate. Now we get to the really provocative part. Schumpeter moves from can it work to does it work better?
Right. Chapter 17 tackles the comparison of the socialist blueprint with the capitalist reality, and he's very upfront about the inherent difficulty here.
Which is?
You're comparing a system that has actually existed with all its flaws and historical baggage, capitalism, against what is still essentially a mental construct, an idealized blueprint, socialism. That's a risky comparison to make fairly.
How does he try to manage that risk?
By setting a very specific criterion for comparison, productive efficiency, which system, he asks, is likely to produce a larger stream of consumer goods and services per unit of time in the long run?
Not just a short burst of output, but sustainable long-term production.
Exactly. And crucially, when he talks about capitalism, he's not comparing socialism to some bygone era of small shop, perfectly competitive capitalism.
I know it.
Because in his view, that era is largely irrelevant. The capitalism that socialism would potentially replace is the capitalism of his time, and ours the system dominated by big business, oligopoly, and large-scale organization.
He argues that this trustified or monopolistic capitalism had already proven itself vastly more productive than the earlier competitive stage.
Yes. The sheer productive power unleashed by large corporations, advanced technology, and managed innovation was undeniable, even if it came with social costs. So, if socialism is to be considered potentially superior, it must be superior to this highly productive, if imperfect, form of advanced capitalism.
And this leads him to perhaps the most controversial claim in the entire book.
Which is that, judged purely by the criterion of productive efficiency, there's a strong case to be made that the socialist blueprint is potentially superior to even big business capitalism.
Superior. Wow, where does this alleged superiority come from? It's not necessarily better technology, is it?
Not necessarily. Socialism inherits the technology developed by capitalism. The superiority, Schumpeter argues, comes primarily from eliminating sources of waste, friction, and uncertainty that are inherent in the capitalist process, even in its advanced stages.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first major source of waste socialism eliminates?
He points to the gain in sheer rationality and determinateness. Think about how even large capitalist firms operate, especially in oligopolistic markets where there are only a few major players.
A lot of guesswork, strategy, trying to outfox the competition.
Exactly. Enormous amounts of resources, money, time, brain power are spent on competitive strategy, advertising to differentiate identical products, anticipating rivals' moves, reacting to price wars, planning counteroffensives. It's a constant strategic game played in an atmosphere of what he calls paralyzing uncertainty.
This is rational from the perspective of each individual firm trying to survive and maximize profit.
But from the perspective of the economy as a whole, a lot of it is socially wasteful. It's resources diverted from actually producing goods and services into fighting over market share.
It's like an arms race.
It's very much like that. Now, contrast that with the socialist blueprint. All that strategic uncertainty related to competitors simply vanishes. There are no competitors in the same sense.
The central board is coordinating everything.
Right. Decisions in theory are uniquely determined by the plan, by the objective data, by the calculation rules. The path to finding the most efficient allocation or the best production method should be much smoother, much less costly, because you're solving one big optimization problem instead of navigating millions of conflicting, secret, competitive strategies.
So less energy spent on the game, more on production itself.
That's the argument. The socialist blueprint operates at a higher level of rationality, as he puts it, because it eliminates the indeterminacy inherent in market competition.
Okay, what's the next big efficiency gain, he claims?
This one is huge. The elimination of cyclical waste. The boom and bust cycle, the business cycle, which Schumpeter himself analyzed so brilliantly as being driven by waves of innovation under capitalism.
He sees that cycle as fundamentally wasteful.
Yes. While the booms are productive, the inevitable busts, depressions, and recessions involve massive underutilization of resources, idle factories, unemployed workers. Progress under capitalism, he argues, occurs in disruptive leaps and bounds, followed by periods of painful readjustment and contraction.
And how does the socialist blueprint avoid this?
Through systematic coordination and the ability to manage innovation and investment in a more orderly fashion over time. In capitalism, a problem in one sector, say, a collapse in demand for cars can trigger financial panic, credit contraction, and cascade across the entire economy, causing, say, the housing construction sector to grind to a halt even if there's underlying demand for houses.
The linkages are chaotic and prone to panic.
Exactly. In the socialist blueprint, the central board sees the whole picture. If resources are freed up because fewer cars are needed, perhaps due to a planned shift, the board doesn't panic. It sees those freed up resources, steel, labor, engineering capacity, as inputs that can be immediately and deliberately redirected to another sector where they are needed, like building houses or infrastructure.
So they can smooth out the introduction of new technologies or shifts in demand.
That's the idea. By coordinating investment and resource allocations centrally, they can avoid the simultaneous bunching of investments that leads to booms and the subsequent collapses and generalized depressions. Problems remain localized and are managed as technical reallocation challenges, not systemic crises.
Now, that sounds great in theory, but it does assume the central board has incredible foresight and perfect information, doesn't it? That seems like a huge assumption.
It is a huge assumption, and it's the core of the counterargument, echoing Mises. Schumpeter acknowledges the immense complexity. His argument rests on the potential superiority of the logic. He believes that the waste generated by the uncertainty and lack of coordination in capitalism is fundamentally greater than the waste that might arise from the complexity of central planning, assuming the computational tools are adequate.
So he thinks the inefficiency of competition is worse than the potential inefficiency of bureaucracy.
In the long run, yes, that seems to be his bet based on the blueprint's logic. It's a comparison of imperfections.
Okay. What other sources of waste does socialism eliminate? There was something about friction.
Yes, the friction reduction and social loss, which is tied to the fundamental antagonism between the private and public spheres in a commercial or capitalist society.
The constant battle between business and government.
Precisely. Schumpeter uses some really strong language here. Let me find that quote. Here it is. He says, quote 1, the friction. The friction or antagonism between the private and the public sphere was intensified from the first by the fact that the state has been living on a revenue which was being produced in the private sphere for private purposes and had to be deflected from these purposes by political force.
Deflected by political force. That really frames taxation and regulation as inherently conflictual.
It does. And his point is that an enormous amount of society's resources, particularly its best brains, are absorbed in managing this conflict.
You mean lawyers, lobbyists, accountants?
Exactly. Lawyers fighting regulations, lobbyists influencing legislation, accountants minimizing tax burdens, compliance officers navigating complex rules, financial engineers finding loopholes, all incredibly intelligent people doing work that is, from a purely social production standpoint, largely defensive or geared towards maneuvering within this conflict zone. It doesn't actually produce more goods or services.
It's about slicing the pie, not growing it.
Right. Schumpeter calls these protective activities. In the socialist blueprint, where the state is the economy, this fundamental conflict disappears. The need for this vast apparatus of lawyers, lobbyists, and tax specialists devoted to the private versus public struggle evaporates.
And the idea is that all that high-level talent could then be redirected to actually managing production, improving technology, or planning more effectively.
Yes. He argues this represents a potentially huge, non-infinitesimal economic gain, shifting those best brains from fighting over the rules to actually running the system more efficiently.
Now, I have to push back a bit here. Is that realistic? Doesn't the conflict just move inside the system? Instead of lobbying Congress, don't ambitious managers just lobby the Central Planning Board for more resources or favorable treatment?
Yeah.
Doesn't political maneuvering replace market maneuvering?
That's a very fair and common critique, and Schumpeter doesn't dwell on it extensively, though he acknowledges the problem of bureaucracy later. Critics would absolutely argue that you just swap one form of wasteful competition, market-based, for another, political or bureaucratic. The struggle for resources and influence continues just within the state apparatus.
So the friction might just change its form.
It might. Schumpeter seems to be banking on the idea that a truly rationalized, meritocratic bureaucracy, guided by the clear, quantitative goals of the plan, could minimize this internal politicking more effectively than the inherently adversarial capitalist system manages external market competition. Again, it's the blueprint versus the messy reality.
Okay, and related to this friction is the issue of taxation itself.
Right, that's another major efficiency gain he sees. In the socialist commonwealth, since the state owns and controls all the means of production and receives the entire social product minus what's paid out in vouchers, traditional taxation simply vanishes.
No need to extract revenue from a reluctant private sector.
Exactly. This eliminates two things. First, the huge administrative cost of assessing, collecting, and enforcing taxes. And second, the economic damage that taxes inevitably cause, distorting incentives, discouraging investment or work, creating deadweight losses. Getting rid of the entire tax system is presented as a pure efficiency gain.
So if we sum up this chapter, Schumpeter's case for the potential superiority of the socialist blueprint rests on it being inherently more rational, less uncertain, free from destructive business cycles, and able to eliminate the massive waste generated by the conflict between private business and the state, including taxation.
That's the core of the argument. It's designed, on paper at least, to operate at a higher level of rationality and lower level of friction than even the most advanced forms of capitalism.
All right, so we've got the blueprint. It's logically sound, potentially more efficient. But now we crash into what feels like the biggest wall: people, the human element.
Exactly. Chapter 18 tackles the most common and perhaps most potent practical objections to socialism. The argument basically goes, okay, the blueprint looks nice on paper, but it could never work in reality because of human nature.
The classic objection, often summarized as needing demigods to direct the socialist engine and archangels to man it.
That's the phrase Schumpeter himself uses to capture the criticism. It implies two fundamental problems. First, the sheer administrative complexity is too much for mere mortals to handle. You need demigods. And second, ordinary people lack the motivation or ethical character to make it work without the driving force of self-interest and the discipline of competition. You need archangels.
Okay, how does Schumpeter counter the demigods argument, the idea that the task is just too complex for human managers?
He actually argues the opposite. He suggests that once the initial, very difficult transition period is over, the actual running of the established socialist economy might be easier than steering a large corporation through the unpredictable storms of capitalist competition.
Easier. How can running an entire economy be easier than running one company?
Because, in the blueprint, much of the uncertainty is removed. The system is unified, the environment is controlled, major cyclical disruptions are eliminated, in theory, and the rules for decision-making are clear, like the marginal cost rule. The managers aren't constantly guessing what competitors will do or worrying about market crashes.
So the required skills change. You need less of that high-stakes, intuitive, risk-taking entrepreneurial genius.
And more competent, rational, perhaps even bureaucratic administrators who can follow the plan and execute the calculations. The heavy lifting of calculation is embedded in the system's logic, the Barron framework. The management task becomes more about efficient implementation within that known framework. So no demigods needed, just well-trained public servants.
Okay, that addresses the competence issue. What about the archangels problem? The motivation and ethics. You get rid of the profit motive, the fear of bankruptcy. Why would anyone work hard or innovate? Don't you need everyone to be selfless?
Schumpeter is famously quite cynical about expecting any fundamental change in human nature. He states very clearly, no fundamental reform of the human soul is required or expected.
So no need for everyone to suddenly become altruistic saints.
Not at all. All that's needed, he argues, is what he calls change by reconditioning. People's habits, motivations, and behaviors adapt to the social environment they live in. If you change the institutional structure, you change the incentive structure, and people's behavior will adjust accordingly over time.
And he stresses that the socialist system shouldn't just discard the talent pool it inherits from capitalism.
Absolutely not. He sees the managerial and technical class developed under capitalism, the acte bourgeois, as he sometimes calls them, as a crucial national asset. These people have been selected and trained by the rigorous competitive process of capitalism. They possess supernormal quality in administration and organization. Socialism should use them.
But how do you motivate them if you take away the primary capitalist reward, making a personal fortune?
This brings us squarely to the problem of bureaucratic management, which Schumpeter accepts as an inevitable feature of any large-scale modern organization, and especially of centralist socialism.
He sees bureaucracy not as an evil, but as a necessity for large scale.
Yes, an all-embracing bureaucratic apparatus is the necessary counterpart to modern industrial society and democracy, he thinks. The real challenge isn't avoiding bureaucracy, but making it work effectively, reconciling individual initiative and motivation with the mechanics and potential inertia of a large bureaucracy.
So if profit isn't the driver, what is? Pure public spirit.
He thinks pure altruism or sense of duty is insufficient on its own to motivate the millions of people needed to run the system, especially at peak performance. So, the socialist state must adopt a system of rewards. But the nature of those rewards shifts.
From money to
social recognition and prestige. Schumpeter taps into a very deep psychological insight here. Human beings have a powerful drive for distinction, for social status, for deference from others.
Keeping up with the Joneses, but in a socialist way.
Sort of, but it's less about material goods and more about recognized status. In capitalism, he argues, achieving significant prestige usually requires accumulating wealth because you need money to buy the symbols of status and command deference: big houses, fancy cars, philanthropy, etc. Money is the main index of success.
But in socialism,
The state controls the means of production, and it can control the distribution of status and prestige directly. The link between personal wealth and social standing can be broken or at least significantly weakened.
and this is where he uses that incredibly memorable, slightly tongue-in-cheek example.
Yes, the famous penny stamp analogy. He suggests that successful managers or innovators could be perfectly motivated by non-pecuniary rewards like titles, honors, or even seemingly trivial things.
Right.
Like, he says, the privilege, if granted with judicious economy, of being allowed to stick a penny stamp on their trousers.
A penny stamp. What's the genius of that?
The genius is that it costs the state practically nothing in real resources. But if that stamp becomes a widely recognized symbol of high achievement, if it signals that this person is important, that they have outperformed their peers, that they deserve respect and deference within the system, then it achieves the same psychological effect as a huge bonus or stock options might in capitalism. It satisfies that deep human craving for distinction and social distance.
So the state manufactures and distributes status symbols instead of just allowing wealth to do it.
Exactly. And history provides examples, doesn't it? Think of the elaborate systems of honors, titles, medals, and privileges, like access to special stores or resorts, used in the Soviet Union and other state socialist systems to motivate workers, scientists, and managers. The hero of socialist labor medal was their version of the penny stamp, perhaps.
So the drive to excel, to compete, to be recognized doesn't disappear. It just gets channeled differently, using motivators that the socialist bureaucracy controls.
That's Schumpeter's argument. Human motivation is adaptable. You just need to provide the right non-pecuniary incentives and condition people to value them.
Okay, that deals with motivation for high performers. But what about the other end? What about discipline, enforcing rules, dealing with slackers or troublemakers? Capitalism uses the threat of unemployment, right? What does socialism use?
This brings us to the absolutely crucial issue of discipline. And here, Schumpeter is quite blunt. He argued earlier that capitalism, especially in its later stages, was losing its ability to enforce discipline. Its moral authority was weakening.
Right, the balance shifting towards protecting the worker.
Yes. Socialism, he argues, cannot function without regaining effective authoritarian discipline.
Authoritarian. That sounds ominous. Why is it necessary?
He gives a few reasons. First, simple self-discipline or group discipline might not be enough, especially over the long haul or without constant reinforcement. Second, there will always be what he calls the subnormal performer, a fringe group, maybe 25% he speculates, who are unwilling or unable to meet standards without coercion. And third, conflict doesn't just vanish with private property. There will still be disagreements, grievances, and potentially people with a vested interest in social unrest, stirring up trouble.
So even without class conflict in the Marxist sense, you still need authority to keep order and ensure performance.
That's his view. So the question becomes, why is the socialist management potentially better equipped to enforce this necessary discipline than the management in a declining, fettered capitalist system?
And the answer is?
Because the socialist authority regains the moral allegiance of the public and the full backing of the state apparatus. In late capitalism, the state often mediates between labor and capital, sometimes siding with labor. The employer's authority is contested.
But in socialism?
In socialism, the management is the state, acting in the perceived interest of the whole society. Resisting management directives is no longer a private dispute. It's an act against the community, against the social interest itself.
This gives the state much stronger tools, doesn't it?
Immensely stronger, and Schumpeter is starkly realistic about this. The main tool is the threat of dismissal.
But isn't that the same as in capitalism?
Not functionally. In capitalism, getting fired is bad, but usually there's a possibility of finding another job elsewhere. The system is pluralistic. In a fully centralized socialist system, where the state is the only employer,
There is no elsewhere.
exactly. Dismissal can mean, as Schumpeter puts it, withholding sustenance that cannot be secured by an alternative employment. It's a far more potent threat. Similarly, collective action like a strike changes its meaning entirely. It's no longer a wage dispute. It's potentially viewed as mutiny or sabotage against the state plan.
He actually points to the Soviet Union as evidence that this kind of discipline is achievable.
Yes, specifically the period after 1928 with the launch of the first five-year plan. He observes how, after the initial revolutionary chaos, the Soviet state successfully reimposed industrial discipline.
How do they do that? Do they just crush the unions?
Interestingly, no. He notes that the trade unions weren't abolished, they were fundamentally repurposed. They stopped being organizations fighting management for workers' interests. They became, in his words, exponents of the social interests and into tools of discipline and performance. They actively started promoting state goals, encouraging higher output, supporting piece rate wages, which opposes wage equality, arguing against strikes, and even supporting the manager's right to fire workers for inefficiency or indiscipline.
Wow. So the unions became instruments of state control over the workforce.
That's how Schumpeter interprets the evidence. The state could enforce this because the official ideology declared that class conflict was over. Therefore, any resistance to the plan wasn't legitimate worker struggle, it was antisocial behavior, an attack on the collective good, potentially counter-revolutionary.
It's a pretty chilling analysis of how discipline can be manufactured and enforced.
It is, and it's crucial to understand Schumpeter isn't endorsing the brutality that often accompanied this in reality. His point is purely analytical. Institutionally, it is possible for a socialist state to establish and maintain a high degree of labor discipline, arguably much higher than is possible in a democratic, rights-conscious, late capitalist society. The instruments are there, and they are powerful.
He does suggest, though, that maybe the harshness seen in Russia was due to the specific circumstances.
Yes, he attributes the cruelties to individuals largely to the unripeness of the situation, the fact that it was a premature revolutionary transition. He implies that in a society transitioning at maturity, the same principle of disciplined conformity to the central plan would apply, but perhaps enforced through less brutal means more akin to civil service discipline.
Okay, so summing up this section on the human element, Schumpeter argues you don't need demigods, the administrative task is manageable, maybe easier, and you don't need archangels. Human motivation can be reconditioned towards status and prestige, and discipline can be effectively enforced by the unified socialist state. The human objections, in his view, are not insurmountable barriers to the blueprint's functioning.
All right, so we've ticked the boxes. The blueprint is logical, it's potentially efficient. The human element challenges can, theoretically, be managed. But there's that big caveat Schumpeter mentioned right at the start, which he returns to in Chapter 19.
The conditions have to be right.
Exactly. The success, and especially the manner, of the transition to socialism depends enormously on the stage of capitalist development reached before the transition happens. This leads him to draw a sharp contrast between two very different scenarios for how socialism might actually come about.
Okay, what's the first scenario?
The first path is transition in maturity, or socialization occurring in the fullness of time. This is the scenario where capitalism has essentially done most of the preparatory work itself.
What does that look like? What are the signs of maturity?
It means the economy is already dominated by large, bureaucratized corporations. Ownership of these corporations has become widely dispersed and depersonalized think shareholders who have no real control, just a financial claim. The function of the entrepreneur is largely gone.
Replaced by managers.
Right. Professional executives who already think and act much like high-level civil servants. Technical progress might have slowed down, become more routine. Interest rates might be very low, close to zero, making the pure capitalist return on ownership less significant. And crucially, the psychology has shifted. People are used to large organizations, bureaucratic procedures, and maybe the old bourgeois values have weakened.
So capitalism has basically become sclerotic and bureaucratized from within.
That's the idea. It's reached a stage where the institutional setup is already quite close to what a centrally planned system might look like, just still under private ownership flags.
In the scenario, if the political will emerges to transition to socialism, what does that transition actually look like? Is it violent? Disruptive?
Schumpeter argues it could be remarkably smooth, almost a mere formality, because the underlying economic and social structures are already largely in place, and crucially, the souls, the attitudes and expectations of the people are prepared for it. Resistance would likely be weak and ineffective.
No need for a bloody revolution.
Not necessarily. He suggests it could potentially be accomplished peacefully, perhaps through democratic means like a constitutional amendment nationalizing key industries.
Yeah.
There wouldn't need to be a dramatic break in legal continuity. People might just accept it as the next logical step, the fait accompli, because the spirit of entrepreneurial capitalism had already faded away.
And what about the owners? Do they just get expropriated, lose everything?
This is where the maturity aspect is key economically. Schumpeter argues that a socialist regime taking over in this mature, highly productive state is under no economic necessity to simply confiscate all private wealth.
Why not? Can't they just take it?
They could, but they don't have to, and it might be politically unwise. Because the economy is already highly productive, the new socialist state can afford to be, in a sense, generous to the former owners to ease the transition and minimize resistance.
How would that work? What's the mechanism?
The state takes control of the assets, the factories, the infrastructure, but instead of just wiping out the claims of the former stockholders and bondholders, it could compensate them. For example, by issuing them new government bonds that pay a certain rate of interest or fixed annuities for a period of time.
So they convert their ownership shares into claims on the state.
Exactly. They become rentiers living off state payments instead of corporate dividends. Schumpeter points out that in a highly developed capitalist society, these shareholders and bondholders might actually form a very large group, maybe even a majority of the electorate. So buying them out, or at least placating them with annuities, makes the transition politically much smoother.
Where does the state get the money to pay these annuities?
From the proceeds of the industries it now controls, over time these payments could be managed and perhaps gradually reduced through mechanisms like high income taxes or inheritance taxes, eventually phasing them out. It's a way to make the expropriation gradual and less painful.
So a gentle transition.
Relatively speaking, yes. He gives the example of potentially socializing key sectors like banking, insurance, railroads, mining, steal the commanding heights in a country like Britain, as he saw it in 1938. It could happen sector by sector, minimizing economic shock, keeping the existing expert managers in place, now as state employees, and basically ensuring the economy continues to run without a major breakdown.
Okay, so that's the maturity scenario. Peaceful, gradual, leveraging the structures capitalism already built. What's the alternative?
The alternative is transition and immaturity. This is what happens if the move towards socialism occurs prematurely, typically driven by a political opportunity like a war or a revolution, before capitalism has reached that mature, bureaucratized stage.
So the things and souls are as yet unprepared, as he puts it.
Precisely. In this scenario, capitalism is still vigorous, the entrepreneurial spirit is strong, ownership might still be concentrated in the hands of active owner-managers, or there are still lots of independent small and medium-sized businesses. Crucially, the mindset of the population, including the workers, might still be largely bourgeois, believing in private property, competition, maybe distrustful of central authority.
He used the U.S. in the 1930s as an example of a place not yet mature enough for a smooth transition, right? Too much dynamism, too fragmented.
Yes, he argued that the sheer organizational task of trying to centralize such a vibrant, fragmented economy would have been immense, quite apart from the political resistance.
So if a socialist takeover happens in this immature context, what does the transition look like then?
It almost inevitably requires revolution, a fundamental break in legal continuity, likely involving violence, coercion, maybe even a reign of terror, because the existing ruling class and potentially large segments of the population will resist fiercely, believing they are defending freedom and prosperity.
It can't be done peacefully or gradually.
Not according to Schumpeter. The resistance is too strong, the institutions aren't ready.
And what are the immediate economic consequences of such a revolutionary transition?
He identifies one absolutely unavoidable consequence: massive inflation.
Inflation. Why inflation?
For two main reasons. First, the revolutionary chaos itself disrupts production and paralyzes the economy, leading to shortages and likely forcing the new regime to print money just to keep things functioning minimally and pay its supporters. Second, and more strategically, inflation becomes a primary tool for the revolution to destroy the old bourgeois order.
How does inflation destroy the old order?
By destroying the value of the assets held by the bourgeoisie. Schumpeter approvingly quotes Lenin's alleged remark: "In order to destroy bourgeois society, you must debauch its money." Rampant inflation effectively confiscates wealth held in currency, bonds, and fixed contracts, wiping out the economic tower base of the old class without needing formal, legal expropriation decrees for everything.
So inflation becomes a weapon of class warfare in this scenario.
Yes, a necessary tool for financing the revolution and dismantling the previous economic structure. Furthermore, Schumpeter argues that socialization in this revolutionary context cannot be gradual. It must be full and one stroke.
Meaning they have to take over everything immediately. Wow.
Because if the revolution breaks the existing legal and social framework, any parts of the private economy left standing will likely cease to function anyway. Business owners will obstruct, credit will dry up, workers might become undisciplined or hostile, the humor of the workman, as he puts it. Trying to run a mixed system in the midst of revolutionary upheaval is impossible. The new state must seize total control immediately to have any chance of restoring order and production.
So the immature path is necessarily revolutionary, violent, inflationary, and requires immediate total state control.
That's the stark picture Schumpeter paints. And he concludes it's a path likely to lead to immense short-term and possibly long-term economic suffering and destruction. It benefits mainly those who engineer the revolution, he suggests, rather than society as a whole, because the cost of premature transition is catastrophic.
The contrast couldn't be clearer. Maturity allows for a potentially peaceful, managed transition. Immaturity demands violent revolution and risks chaos.
Exactly. And it's important to remember why Schumpeter spends so much time on this. It's not because he's advocating for socialism. It's because he genuinely believed that the long-term internal trends of capitalism, bureaucratization, depersonalization of ownership, the decline of the entrepreneur were pushing advanced Western societies towards that state of maturity.
Making the nonviolent bureaucratic transfer of control seem like the more probable, or at least plausible, long-run trajectory in his view.
Yes, it flowed logically from his analysis of capitalism's own evolution. The feasibility study of socialism was, in a sense, his attempt to understand the characteristics of the system that capitalism itself seemed to be slowly, inexorably morphing into. Hashtag tag outro.
So let's try to wrap our heads around this. We've gone through Schumpeter's deep dive into the workings of a potential socialist system. What does this all mean for you listening to this? He gives us this incredibly cold, detached, institutional analysis. No cheers for socialism, no condemnation either, just can it work?
Right. He deliberately strips away the moral dimension for this part of the analysis. He's not asking if it's good, just if it's possible. And his answer is yes, under certain conditions, particularly that condition of maturity.
And his analysis really cuts both ways, doesn't it? It challenges the kind of capitalist triumphalism that says there is no alternative by showing that, logically, a centrally planned system can achieve rational allocation. The free market isn't the only path to economic rationality.
Absolutely. It decouples economic rationality from private property, which is a huge theoretical move. But at the same time, it completely demolishes the utopian socialist dream, doesn't it?
How so?
Because the socialist system he describes as workable and efficient isn't some commune of free spirits living in harmony. It's a highly disciplined, potentially authoritarian, all-embracing bureaucratic apparatus. It's essentially a giant, rationally managed megacorporation running the entire country. Efficiency is achieved through central control and the elimination of dissent and friction, not necessarily through greater freedom or equality.
That concept of cultural indeterminateness comes back.
Yeah.
The efficient economic machine could have almost any political or ethical face.
Exactly. So the question Schumpeter leaves you with is profound. If this highly rationalized, bureaucratic, potentially non-democratic system is a viable economic alternative, how do we evaluate it? We can't just rely on economic performance metrics, nor can we assume its cultural or political outcomes will match our ideals.
It forces a much colder, harder look at the trade-offs involved. And it makes you wonder, looking around today with massive global corporations, increasing automation, complex state regulation, the merging of public and private functions, he talked about how close are we to that state of maturity Schumpeter described. Does his analysis of a potential transition feel more relevant now than maybe it did even in 1942?
That is the lingering and perhaps uncomfortable question his analysis raises for the present. Is the world he described, where the institutional lines blur and the potential for a bureaucratic transfer of control emerges, closer than we think? His socialism wasn't about red flags and revolution in the mature scenario. It was about the quiet culmination of bureaucratic logic.
Okay, so we've established the economic viability, maybe even potential superiority of the blueprint. We've addressed the human element, we've looked at the transition, but there's one massive piece of the puzzle left, isn't there?
The elephant in the room, democracy.
Can this rationalized, efficient, disciplined, bureaucratic socialist order coexist with democratic governance as we understand it? Or does the very logic of central planning inevitably lead away from democratic control?
That is precisely the question Schumpeter tackles next in part 4 of the book. But characteristically, before he can answer whether socialism is compatible with democracy, he first has to tell us what he thinks democracy actually is.
And knowing Schumpeter, it's probably not going to be the standard textbook definition.
Not at all. He famously dismisses the classical ideal of democracy as rule by the people and proposes his own very different competitive theory democracy as a method, a political process where elites compete for the people's vote, much like firms compete for consumers.
Okay, that sounds like a whole other deep dive in itself.
It is, and understanding his specific theory of democracy is absolutely crucial for grasping his final conclusions about the complex relationship between socialism and democratic governance.
We will definitely tackle that Schumpeter's theory of democracy and its implications for socialism in our next session. This has been an intense exploration of the socialist blueprint. Thanks for walking us through it.
A genuine pleasure. It's challenging stuff, but essential for understanding Schumpeter's overall argument. Looking forward to discussing democracy next time.